Why does North Korea hate the US? An irrational hatred for American freedoms? A crazy leader? Jealousy? Sadly, no. The answer lies in what they perceive to be decades of unprovoked US aggression that has left deep and lasting scars on the Korean peninsula. The arbitrary division of Korea in 1945 and the devastating US bombing campaigns that followed during the Korean War are not distant memories. The mass death at American hands shaped a collective memory and a strong spirit of resistance against foreign domination, especially the US. For North Korea, the hostility against the US and its allies is easily seen as a reasonable defensive posture, a refusal to submit to the US-dominated hegemonic world order that denies independence to nations unwilling to bend to foreign policy interests of the US. Back to the video in just a second. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Conflict of Nations. History has shown us how strategy, alliances, and bold decisions can change the course of a war. Now imagine stepping into the shoes of a commander in the heat of a modern global conflict. That's exactly what you get with Conflict of Nations, a free online PvP strategy game that lets you lead a real country during a hypothetical world war. Fight against up to 128 players in real-time battles that unfold over weeks. Build your forces with tanks, jets, and even nuclear submarines. Then decide, will you conquer through war or diplomacy? Forge alliances, declare war, and take over the world. Your strategy is key. The irony of this ad is not lost on me. The best part? You can play anytime, anywhere, on PC or mobile, with the same account. And if you click the link in the description, you'll get an exclusive gift, 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. But hurry, this offer is only available for 30 days. So what are you waiting for? It's time to take command through my link in the description. Addendum. This video isn't a commentary on whether North Korea is a good or bad country, quote unquote, whatever those labels mean. It's an exploration of why their perspective is the way it is, and any intellectually honest person would be interested in hearing the other side to see if it has merit. Let's continue. North Korea, officially called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, occupies the northern half of the Korean peninsula. It's bordered by China, the Korean Bay, the Sea of Japan, and of course, South Korea. At 120,000 square kilometers in total area, the DPRK houses around 26 million people, with a significant portion residing in urban centers like the capital, Pyongyang. The DPRK was officially founded in 1948 under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, establishing a central ideology called Juche, or self-reliance, which has served as a guiding philosophy of sorts for the nation. North Korea's anti-imperial stance is deeply rooted in its early 20th century history, when it was just known as Korea. Long before the US was the imperialist enemy of North Korea, Japan brutally occupied the entire peninsula from 1910 to 1945, a period marked by severe repression, forced assimilation, and sex slavery, an issue of contention with Japan to this day. Policies of forced labor, limited political freedoms for Koreans, and mandatory participation in Shinto rituals were calculated to erase the native spiritual practices and culture of Korea. Yet Koreans resisted, reclaiming traditional practices, and ultimately refused to bow down to Japanese imperial demands. After World War II, Korea was arbitrarily divided by the US after realizing that a free and open democratic election would result in an overwhelming Communist Party victory, much like in Germany following World War II. That definitely didn't suit the US, so they instead created a puppet state in what became South Korea, now the Republic of Korea. And while doing this under the guise of defending democracy and freedom, they would install a brutal dictator named Syngman-rhee, an anti-communist exile who barely spent any time in Korea. This is juxtaposed by Kim Il-sung, the man who would go on to lead the DPRK, who had spent his life in the anti-Japanese struggle and for Korean independence. The conflict widened in scope when the Soviet Union and China intervened on the side of their ally, with the US doing the same for South Korea. This division set the stage for the Korean War, the first proxy war of the Cold War. Syngman-rhee, a dependable pro-Western puppet, was ruling half the Korean peninsula. Despite his total lack of local support, the first thing he did was suppress the incredibly popular left, much like Suharto would go on to do in Indonesia, always with American support, of course. Check out the Jakarta method. Rhee did so enthusiastically and systematically. Under Rhee and the US's occupation of South Korea, only those deemed reliable or loyal by American standards had any place in Korean politics. By 1946, the US military dictatorship in South Korea had filled all of its government positions with right-wing elites to the exclusion of popular worker and peasant movements. And by exclusion, I mean by imprisoning their leaders, pushing them underground, or just outright killing them. This violent suppression led to the isolation of all opposition, and left a single party to rule the South. But any democracy was just for show, since liberals love political theater, and the US wanted to play dress-up with political legitimacy. Despite this, many South Koreans continued to support socialist ideals and continued to be imprisoned for it. Meanwhile, in the north, reforms that were begun prior to American intervention were happening fast. Within months, North Korea abolished landlords, redistributed land, and nationalized industries, exactly the kind of necessary overhaul that had long been called for by Koreans for a liberated Korea. It is and was a formula that actually works to end poverty for the widest base of society. Unlike the violent repression in the South, the North's transformation was quick and efficient, creating a government aligned with local aspirations rooted in Korean culture. And like clockwork, anytime the US sees a project not aligned with its interests take root and begin to bear fruit, it tries to cut it down and turn it into wood chips. Here enters the Korean War, where over the next few years, American forces dropped an estimated 635,000 tons of bombs across Korea, with the majority of that hitting the North, including 32,000 tons of napalm. More bombs hit Korea than Japan in World War II, which is quite a feat. The core history of the conflict is complicated, and who begun the war with what actions depends on which action you consider critical for sparking the conflict. Watch the following video for further detail, or check out the fantastic work Patriots, Traitors, and Empires, The Story of Korea's Struggle for Freedom by Goans for a deeper dive. Anyway, the goal was obvious: to destroy North Korea's industrial capacity and to break the will of its people. Cities like Pyongyang were leveled to the point that civilians had to take refuge in caves to survive the onslaught. In fact, the total amount of destruction rendered practically every city of the North completely flattened. I made a video that covered this in further detail here. By 1952, North Korea was left in ruins. Bombings destroyed crucial infrastructure, creating massive shortages in food, housing, and basic supplies. Entire communities survived in caves, shanties, or improvised shelters. The destruction of hydroelectric dams led to widespread flooding, crippling agriculture even further. Fertilizer factories were among the many targeted, contributing to an agricultural crisis that left North Korea on the brink of famine. The toll from this collection of circumstances was utterly devastating. Approximately 2 million North Koreans had died, most of them civilians who fell victim to US bombs and starvation, in just a few short years. These strategic bombings weren't just meant to win a war, they were intended to systematically dismantle North Korea's ability to survive independently. As a result of this extensive bombing and napalming, only a small percentage of North Korea's agricultural land remains arable today. The 1953 armistice only ended active military combat, but it left the peninsula in limbo. South Korea refused to sign the armistice, but had other agreements with the US that halted their active military operations. The US later signed a mutual defense treaty with its loyal puppet South Korea, committing to a permanent military presence along the fortified 38th parallel, which remains one of the most militarized borders in the world today. The ongoing US presence has only deepened the divide. For North Koreans, the memory of the US invasion and the destruction it caused is an integral part of their identity. The systematic devastation of neighborhoods, infrastructure, and food supplies has been ingrained in North Korean consciousness as a proof of American aggression. That's not forgetting the 10 to 20% of the population that was killed as a result. Understanding this context is crucial. It's why North Korea sees the US as a central obstacle to peace, independence, and unification on the Korean peninsula. And they happen to be correct about that point. The Korean War is only the beginning of the story. The United States went further and has waged a decades-long economic war that's made it increasingly difficult for the people living in North Korea to survive. One of the primary tools America uses to get their way is sanctions. These economic blockades are designed to cripple a nation, isolate it from the world, and bring about conditions of change favorable to American foreign policy, all while framing the oppression as a morally justified response to rogue behavior.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
And all of this happens without any reflection that, at a certain point, sanctions just become collective punishment which should be against international law and is technically a war crime. This is especially true when it comes to US sanctions on North Korea. The US, in its arrogance, has behaved as if controlling North Korea's economy through sanctions was some kind of divine right. During Clinton's regime, the US unleashed severe economic sanctions on 35 countries, which at the time affected 42% of the world's population, having lethal consequences on a mass scale due to basic living standards plummeting under the guise of protecting global security, a favorite liberal trope. This tactic isn't new or unique, it's an ancient strategy that involves starving a subject population into submission and manipulating public sentiment against their government. In other words, it's extortion on a mass scale, or terrorism, or whatever other term that's valid. Yet North Korea's people have proven to be tremendously resilient, which renders sanctions ineffective and makes sanctions even crueler than they already are. Instead of fermenting dissent, sanctions have only fueled a fierce collective defiance reinforced against the US and its allies. Take it from me, an Iraqi. No one in Iraq has ever felt that the Iraqi government is responsible for the suffering imposed on it by the American sanctions regime. The severe and deep and enduring anti-Americanism in Iraq is a direct result of American policies in the region and particularly in my country. It's no different in Syria, in Libya, in Afghanistan, or in the DPRK. One of the most destructive aspects of US sanctions for North Korea is the carefully calculated restriction of essential medical and humanitarian supplies. For example, under the 2017 sanctions, any metal products were broadly prohibited, which meant that medical shipments that included essential sterilization tools, like aluminum steam sterilizers used in reproductive health kits and surgical instruments, were effectively not allowed entry into the DPRK. By blocking something as basic as this, any and all public health efforts are made harder or even impossible, since hospitals have a harder time keeping conditions hygienic enough to perform safe procedures. Worse still, North Korean hospitals cannot obtain spare parts for essential devices like CT scanners, ventilators, and X-ray machines without applying for some special export license, and even these are often denied or face long delays. And of course, the US has sanctions on fuel, like refined petroleum and diesel fuel. Those fuels power hospital generators, heating facilities, and running medical equipment. Again, rural hospitals have been hit harder and are forced to reduce operations during the winter months, which leaves pregnant women, young children, and elderly patients at risk. Without vital medical equipment, such as respirators running, many completely avoidable deaths occur, which they wouldn't were it not for US sanctions. Despite these sanctions, however, the DPRK has against all odds formed a model healthcare system for low-income countries, in comparison to that of the wealthiest country on Earth, which guarantees basically nothing in terms of healthcare for its citizens, despite profiting handsomely from spreading misery around the globe. Moving on. For all the criticism leveled at the DPRK for censorship and not letting people contact the outside world, much of it is warranted, they conveniently leave out the fact that even telecommunications infrastructure is sanctioned by the US. Until recently, even something as simple as making a phone call across the border was hampered by sanctions because a direct connection wasn't allowed. In this case, a South Korean company operating in the Kaesong industrial complex had to reroute calls through China at an exorbitant rate of $3.60 per minute due to US restrictions. I don't think most Americans would pay $3.60 per minute for a phone call, let alone citizens of impoverished third world countries. You don't need to take my word for it. The United Nations says economic sanctions exacerbate poverty, disproportionately impact vulnerable populations, and generate unethical business practices that exploit scarcity. Unfortunately, North Korea is no exception. NGOs and humanitarian agencies that help in providing basic necessities to North Koreans state that they are restricted from operating efficiently, often due to long searches and other delays because of US sanctions. These sanctions go against the 1949 Geneva Conventions, which condemns punishments of civilians for the actions of its government. And yet that's exactly what the sanctions do, as we've seen. Food and medical supplies are held up, delayed, or outright blocked. In one absurd case, it took an NGO over a year to deliver just 16 boxes of beans to North Korea. This blatant disregard for humanitarian concerns proves the US is more interested in the systematic punishment of an entire people for the so-called crime of having the wrong government or for being born in the wrong country. Take your pick. A UNICEF report in 2018 estimated that 200,000 North Korean children suffered from acute malnutrition, with 60,000 at risk of starvation because of the delays in humanitarian aid. To remind you, agricultural tools and inputs are also sanctioned by the US, adding on top of the bulk of the arable land being ruined by American bombing runs in the 1950s. This is the definition of shooting someone in the leg and then blaming them when they can't walk. The fact that this suffering is largely ignored by the international community, never called out for being the crime that it is, only strengthens the DPRK's case and perspective against the US, as they witness firsthand the human cost of these cruel and pointless sanctions. If anyone truly cared about human rights in the DPRK, they'd immediately call for the lifting of economic sanctions. Sanctions on North Korea don't just target the government, I think that's clear. They seep into every layer of society and erode the living standards of ordinary citizens. In fact, that is the stated goal of many of the sanctions. For example, the textile industry is one of North Korea's main sources of employment and has been hit very hard by sanctions. Exports are blocked, which means thousands of textile workers, many of whom are women, find themselves unemployed or with reduced income. As a result, many are forced into black market activities to afford everyday necessities like food and clothing. Fishing is another critical industry and food resource nearly severed by sanctions, wiping out a sector that once provided a stable income for many coastal communities for centuries. No access to export markets means a cap on just how much they can catch and viably benefit from. This destabilizes local economies along the coast, along with all downstream industries such as fish processors, transporters, and vendors who rely on fishing industry for their livelihood. Other fuels and metals, like coal and iron ore, North Korea's primary exports, have also felt the wrath of sanctions. In 2018, China's imports of North Korean coal dropped by 88% due to international sanctions, which stripped North Korea of a major and badly needed source of income. By now, you should know the pattern. The US sanctions a commodity, the decline in business forces closures of production facilities, and all downstream production is similarly affected. It's the same story with coal mines and associated facilities, which resulted in more unemployment and further impoverished communities. These are not luxury industries or military projects. They are, or were, the backbone of North Korea's civilian economy. Without access to global markets, North Koreans are forced to use black markets, where prices for things even as basic as food can be prohibitively expensive. And to wrap up, let's stay on the employment issue. The labor market is severely restricted as a result of what was said previously, but also because of sanctions that take away access to joint employment opportunities. In essence, you can't invest in North Korea. An example of this trend is the shutdown of the Kaesong Industrial Complex. It was a large joint North-South facility that employed over 50,000 North Koreans and a symbol of friendship between the South and the North. The shutdown, because of sanctions, resulted in these 50,000 North Koreans being under or unemployed. These are nefarious policies aimed at maximizing misery for the interests of American capital. The United States has likewise kept a military stranglehold on the Korean Peninsula for decades, with roughly 28,000 troops stationed at a few large bases across South Korea meant to counter any potential aggression from the north. This isn't a temporary deployment, and it's extremely expensive, for South Korea, of course. The US isn't altruistic even to its allies. In a recent deal, South Korea agreed to pay over $1.1 billion, with further increases capped at 5% per year, to host the US military presence, a price pushed by the Biden administration to solidify a deal before any possible disruption from the second Trump administration. This new agreement lasts until 2030 to make absolutely sure that it survives past Trump into whatever administration follows him. For North Korea, these forces are there as a threat, obviously. It's the most technically sophisticated military on Earth and its local ally, stationed across the border against your sanctioned and small country. It can be nothing else. Anyway, each year, the US and South Korea carry out joint military so-called exercises, training in everything from missile defense to simulated invasion drills. One of the most extensive, Ulchi Freedom Shield, involved a combination of computer-simulated and live-fire exercises, with some 19,000 South Korean soldiers participating in drills against North Korean attack scenarios, essentially joint US-South Korean invasion exercises. This isn't really a war game, it's a display of power backed up by the increased presence of US long-range nuclear-armed bombers, submarines, and strike groups in the region. Who is the aggressor here, again? North Korea has responded predictably, positioning their nuclear program as an essential deterrent against American aggression. If Iraq had done the same, then we would still be an independent country, and without the excess of 1 million deaths caused by the illegal American invasion. Despite official US claims that regime change isn't the objective, statements and strategies of several US regimes suggest otherwise. North Korea watched other states like Libya dismantle their defenses only to face regime change at the hands of the US. If the DPRK were to disarm, it would likely face a similar fate, being exposed to an aggressive enemy that has historically favored extreme and unrelenting force over diplomacy. So, we should really view North Korea's nuclear deterrent more as a survival strategy against an American military presence than the unhinged world-ending musings of a psychopath. Likewise, and more importantly, they offered to stop nuclear testing entirely for a pledge that the US wouldn't attack. The US ignored the memo, of course. This is one of the many extended olive branches from the north that have gone ignored. Western media's portrayal of the DPRK as a rogue state is a framing used by imperialist powers to vilify nations that defy their hegemony, and also serve as a source of circular logic that itself assumes the US wouldn't lie about something like that for political gain, despite that literally being the point. In this narrative, North Korea is depicted as a dangerous, irrational actor, a threat to global and regional stability, and an obstacle to progress. Progress as defined and measured by what is most profitable to Western capital interests, interestingly enough. Let's not forget the trillions of dollars worth of rare earth metals under North Korean soil. We even made a video on that you can check out here. Few analysts or policymakers attempt to actually understand how the DPRK perceives American aggression, preferring to push a simplistic, cartoonish, and unserious one-sided image of the nation as a villain beyond redemption. This framing is used to block or at least slow down any genuine resolution, which makes sure the crisis continues to serve US imperial interests. However, if we strip away the nonsense, North Korea is being punished because it refuses to submit to globalized exploitation by Western powers, which makes it the ultimate enemy. The DPRK is described as reclusive, backward, and isolated, but no mention is made of the sanctions which hold that end as their explicit purpose. Yet the nation persists, defying expectations of collapse, relying on defense and small concessions extracted from an international community too cowardly to defy the US. Even when the US outwardly recognizes the need for negotiation, as in the Perry Report, its approach and actions still treat North Korea as inherently irrational and dangerous. This ideological project is not limited to the DPRK. Cuba, another country falsely labeled as a rogue state, and I've covered in this series here, has been resisting similar imperialist domination. Cuba is also painted as an unrepentant regime led by an irrational and dangerous group, whose system must change to serve Western capital, of course. This rhetoric suggests these nations are so desperate to maintain power that they endanger their own populations and global stability, framing their survival as both an anomaly and a threat, as simultaneously weak and strong, like how fascists like to depict all their enemies. Instead of engaging with their histories, imperialist discourse reduces North Korea and Cuba to caricatures, presenting their leaders as the sole architects of their nation's problems and suffering. Be completely honest with yourself. Have you ever heard any talk about sanctions, or how they impact the average North Korean before this video, particularly in the Western press? I would bet on no. However, propaganda against the DPRK extends to more than just this. The US and its allies have also and continue to conduct direct campaigns, from propaganda leaflet bombs in the Korean War to balloons filled with anti-regime messages and US dollars sent from South Korea. Attempts at undermining the country are ceaseless. That's aside from all the silliest claims that you see shared all over, with no sources as always. For an overview of that, check out my earlier video here. For further details on defectors and why their stories so frequently fall apart, check out another video here.
Ever victorious Workers' Party opened a new era.
North Korea's identity in the 20th and 21st centuries has largely been shaped by a history of defiance against foreign domination, and much of the latter against the US in particular. Because of the Korean War's devastation and the impact of decades-long sanctions, the DPRK reasonably views itself as a nation fighting to preserve its sovereignty in the face of relentless external pressure that it actually does face, as I've shown in this video. The examples of Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan go far in illustrating that point, and just how bad things can get when the US gets its will. And even though North Koreans are highly resilient, we cannot ignore the incalculable human cost of the conflict. Entire generations have lived in fear under the shadow of war, economic devastation, and systematic deprivation, all because the ruling interests that govern the US aren't allowed to gleefully exploit North Korean resources and people. Again, none of this is a value judgment of the DPRK as a country, just a clear expression that, had sanctions been lifted and the DPRK allowed to be a regular country, not under constant nuclear threat or backbreaking economic blockade, maybe they'd be able to be more open, internationally involved, and cooperative. A better world is possible. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Nitro Dubs, Kenny, Thomas Roberts, Nicholas, Owen Baker, T. Wood, Dr. Lemonman, Lumix, Charlie and Eric, Ultimate Turin, Daniel Ethel, The Generic Guy, Santiago Pereira, Rain, Cassandra Corvus, David Fries, Confuse M, Mariana Mostasevich, Robbie Richardson, and Masay Kadro. Thanks for watching. Don't miss out on Conflict of Nations, the free online PvP strategy game where you can dominate modern global warfare, lead your nation, build your forces, and engage in epic battles to take over the world. Click the link in the description to claim your exclusive gift, 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. The offer is only available for 30 days, so act fast. Choose your country and fight your way to victory today.